if a school only considers ER experience on an individual basis, it's not going to be exactly what they're looking for. It's not going to be their preference. They'll consider you, but it might not be ideal. And the only way to really set yourself apart is to really sell your experience on your resume and make sure you're knocking your interview out of the park. Okay. And a vast majority of schools out there actually say no completely to ER experience. And so this is something that I see a lot of students kind of, struggle with when they get all the way to the application process. And then they realize this when they go to apply. And it has to be gut wrenching to realize you just spent the last 3 years working in an ER and your school does not even accept ER experience. I don't want to see that happen to you. So please, I'm stressing to you, make sure from the day you decide you want to do CRNA that you're thoroughly researching your school. Go to their website. There's another website called the COA, CRNA.org. Well, welcome back, future CRNA, to CRNA School Prep Academy podcast. Today is a very special episode where we are going to share with you our very best application tips and how you can stand out as a CRNA school applicant. We have selected 3 of our previous episodes that are fan favorites, which is all the way back to episode number 6, which is going to reveal what ICU is best for your CRNA application. Then we're going to go on to episode 56, which covers writing a good personal statement. And finally, we're going to wrap up this episode with episode 79, which is how to prepare your resume. These 3 episodes are oldies but goodies. So if you want to listen to the full episode, be sure to do so. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. So the standard that is set for all CRNA schools across the country is that it has to take place in the United States. Your ICU experience, again, needs to come from an ICU within the United States. And it needs to be high acuity, and you need to be dealing with advanced life support and different hemodynamic monitor systems in your experience. And so, schools, it's up to them to kind of decipher what that means as far as what kind of units they prefer. It doesn't mean that a school prefers MICU over SICU or CVICU over NICU or whatever all the ICUs are. There's so many of them. Ultimately, this is a school's preference, essentially. And not all schools will take a NICU or PICU experience. And these schools kind of base their standards on what they think a successful student displays in their program. Meaning, historically, if you look at the data, do students who come from the NICU, PICU pass boards the first time versus a student who came from the CVICU? And so that's kind of how they kind of judge whether they accept certain units versus others. And so I'm kind of going to, again, let you guys know that you need to be researching your school first and foremost to see what units they prefer. And essentially, the units that are the safest units are any adult ICU. And there can be so many different types of adult ICUs out there. There's the SICU, the MICU, the CVICU, the CCU, the burn trauma unit. I mean, you can combine those letters any way you want to make any kind of ICU. There's even a SICU-MICU combination ICU. So it doesn't really matter as long as the acuity is there, that's okay. The reason why NICU and PICU sometimes don't count is because they feel that that's such a very specialized ICU type of experience, and maybe is not the best tailored for CRNA training. I don't necessarily believe that to be true. I've seen plenty of NICU and PICU nurses go on to be very successful. I've worked with NICU PICU nurses before or I should say prior to anesthesia, they were NICU PICU nurses. They're brilliant. And in fact, one of the PICU nurses I did recently work with said one of the advantages of being a PICU nurse prior to anesthesia was the fact that she already knew weight-based calculation and dosing of drugs, which is something that I definitely did not know coming from a MICU background. So again, every background, whether it's neuro or surgical, medical, cardiac, NICU or PICU, you're going to have certain strengths, okay? But you're also going to have weaknesses. The reality is you can't gain all the experience on one unit. And so the key with trying to pick what unit is best for you to gain your ICU experience prior to CRNA school, really comes down to what is the acuity like? How often do you titrate vasoactive drips? How often are you managing vents? And really, do you manage vents at all? Most ICUs, especially the bigger ICUs, have respiratory therapists who manage vents. And there's nothing wrong with that. You still have to be able to troubleshoot the vents yourself to go get an RT to take a look at things. So essentially, even though you're not the one actually making the respiratory changes, you would have to be aware if there was a problem with the patient and also be analyzing blood work to notify the team of potential ventilator issues. If you're seeing that their blood gas came back, that was all out of whack, or whatever labs, again, that you're kind of analyzing as an actual ICU nurse. And so again, picking a unit where you don't see a lot of ventilators, where you don't titrate a lot of vasoactive drips, where you don't see a lot of advanced life support like CRRT or ECMO or balloon pumps or VADs, ICU or Ventrix, ICP bolts, those types of things. You may essentially be not in a high enough acuity unit. Okay. If most of your patients are awake and able to talk to you, that's probably not a good indicator that that's a high acuity ICU. So a lot of people will tell you you need level 1 trauma experience. And the reason for that is not because it's a level 1 trauma, because level 2 trauma is actually essentially the same as far as acuity goes. It just, the biggest difference is the level 1 tends to have more opportunities for research and tends to be at more like academic facilities. But the acuity essentially is usually about the same. But essentially you can have a non-trauma hospital and still have high acuity, but you have to still frequently see ventilators and patients who are on advanced life support. Or as soon as your patient needs a ventilator or needs vasoactive drips or maybe needs Prisma or CRRT, do they get shipped to the nearest trauma center? So that's what I want you to ask yourself. And so when you're interviewing for these ICU positions, you need to be asking the manager, what's the acuity like? How often will I be titrating vasoactive drugs? How often would I be managing ventilators? How often would I potentially get extra training in other advanced life support measures like CRRT or ECMO or those types of opportunities? So it's important to be asking these questions when you're taking your ICU position. And again, remember, based on what unit you work on, you're not going to be able to get all the experience. You're not going to be able to do ECMO and Prisma and VADs and Impellas and Ventrix and ICP bolts. You just can't find a unit that has it all. And it's okay not to have it all. You just have to have something. You just have to have something a little bit extra that puts you in a unit that says to the admissions committee, okay, they clearly came from a high acuity unit because they were taking care of X, Y, and Z. And so again, and as far as PICU, NICU experience, you have to really know whether your school prefers that or not. If they say on an individual basis, what that says to you is they don't prefer that experience. But if you're an overall good candidate in every other way, they'll consider you. I don't necessarily think that's putting your best foot forward going into your application. So as much as it kind of stinks and it seems unfair, and not that I'm at all encouraging any of you to pursue pediatric anesthesia, because I personally do pediatric anesthesia. I love pediatric anesthesia. I just think, unfortunately, if you live in an area with one school and that's the school you want to go to, if they only consider NICU, PICU on an individual basis, you're probably better off getting your experiences in an adult ICU prior to applying to school. And then you can make your shift into pediatric anesthesia after school. The reality is too, in school, you only spend about 3 months of your entire training actually training at a pediatric hospital. The rest of the time you're working with the adult population. And so while I don't think it's impossible for a NICU, PICU nurse to come in there and acclimate to the adult environment, it probably would be more of a challenge considering the vast majority of your training is all adults. And keep in mind too, even if you did NICU, PICU, that's okay. And especially if a school says, yes, we take NICU, PICU, by all means, get that experience. But you're still expected as a candidate to know the difference between a baby and an adult, cardiovascular wise or hemodynamic wise, how to manage those two different types of patient populations. You still need to have an idea of the fact that the physiology is different from a baby and an adult. And why is that? They could potentially ask you that in the interview. So just because your background's only NICU and you really understand a NICU, a neonate's hemodynamics and fluid shifts and how to manage them, you still have to have an idea of how is that different than an adult. So I encourage you, if you do gain that experience in the NICU PICU, that's okay, but just make sure you understand the difference between adult and kids as far as hemodynamic monitoring and management. And again, if the school says on an individual basis, I would see that as a red flag. It doesn't mean that if you want to try it, that's totally fine. Plenty of people get in with on an individual basis, but knowing that going into your application, just make sure that you're highlighting what your strengths are coming from that background and really sell your experience. Make sure your resume really highlights your attributes that you're bringing to the program. Try to think of ways that even if they try to say, well, how are you going to handle this if your experience is only this? How are you going to acclimate to the adult world? Make sure you're really thinking about those hard questions they could ask you and potentially confront you off guard when you're in the interview. As long as you have a way to sell yourself, you're going to be okay. Some of the units I want to caution you about, one of them, the main one that's probably the most common unit that people don't realize is not considered ICU in a lot of settings, is ER experience. And the reason why ER, I know they get a lot of trauma, is you see the really sick patients coming in the door, you're the first responders, you're right there in the action, but you then simply stabilize the patient and get them up to the unit. You're not managing them long-term. And so they really like about the ICU experience is that you're actually managing these patients for an entire shift, that you're not just stabilizing and shipping out. And so that is why ER experience, for the most part, in a lot of schools' eyes, is not equivalent to ICU experience. Now, I've heard of nurses who actually have like a ICU bay in the ER, meaning they keep patients longer because the beds are full in the actual ICU. So they actually have an ICU bay in the ER. Unfortunately, if the school is not super familiar with that hospital and with that system, they may not understand what that's like and really understand how that's qualifies as an ICU. And so again, that's where it really takes your resume to really display that to them. But if a school only considers ER experience on an individual basis, it's not going to be exactly what they're looking for. It's not going to be their preference. They'll consider you, but it might not be ideal. And the only way to really set yourself apart is to really sell your experience on your resume and make sure you're knocking your interview out of the park. Okay. And a vast majority of schools out there actually say no completely to ER experience. And so this is something that I see a lot of students kind of, struggle with when they get all the way to the application process. And then they realize this when they go to apply. And it has to be gut wrenching to realize you just spent the last 3 years working in an ER and your school does not even accept ER experience. I don't want to see that happen to you. So please, I'm stressing to you, make sure from the day you decide you want to do CRNA that you're thoroughly researching your school. Go to their website. There's another website called the CRNA.org. So it's www.CRNA.org. And you can look up your school's stats on that website. But most of the time, these schools are listing their accepted ICU experience on their website under the admission requirements. You could also give your email to these schools and they can actually send you more information. So please do that early on in your path to CRNA. Although I do understand there are some people who don't necessarily choose CRNA until maybe they see CRNAs at the bedside in the ER, placing central lines or doing airways. I get it. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes you just don't know that you want to go on for CRNA until you've actually experienced being around some CRNAs. And so at that moment, I encourage you to start researching your schools. If you're even questioning CRNA, start researching your schools. And that way you make sure you're getting the experience they want. A daily dose of inspiration from a CRNA School Prep Academy student. I just got accepted to the U.S. Army Graduate Program in Anesthesia Nursing starting in 2023. Some facts about me. I've been a nurse for 8 years, the last 4.5 years in the ICU. The first 2 years of ICU was in a mixed ICU at a level 3 trauma center. They had general MICU, surgeries, head and neck, GI, open heart, working with CRRT, inner aortic balloon pumps, Impellas, and ECMO. I traveled as a MICU SICU with, of course, lots of step-down tele floating for 2 years at various level trauma centers, and then settled at a level 1 CT ICU for the last 6 months with heart and lung transplants, ECMO, LVADs, CRRT, Impella, and inner aortic balloon pumps. I did 2 medical mission trips last summer, one with IVHQ and one with One World Surgery. I highly suggest One World Surgery because I got to shadow 5 anesthesia providers between 3 ORs. One was even on the AANA board. I also attended 2 and 1 national AANA conferences. These were crucial in meeting with professors, and I was even preemptively invited to interview and had multiple invites to see their schools and shadow lectures and labs. Networking and fully immersing myself amongst SRNAs and CRNAs was amazing, and I even grew my own passion for the CRNA political community, and I just cannot wait to be an advocate. I also met Richard Wilson and Jenny Fennell, both incredibly welcoming and helpful in meeting with other professors as well. Thank you so much for everything. I know if you're listening to this right now that you know who you are, and it was so incredible meeting you. You just blew me away. The fact that you showed up to these events and you were putting yourself out there, so much to be said for that. And I'm so incredibly proud of you to start your journey into becoming a CRNA. I look forward to seeing you again at future conferences. So you guys, I shared this success story because it is full of little golden nuggets. So I really think you should stop and rewind and jot down some notes. CSPA would love to share more golden nuggets with you, so be sure to sign up for our free Future CRNA newsletter. The link is in the show notes or comments below. Cheers to your future. Now back to the show. So first, why do they have you write a personal statement? What's the purpose behind writing a personal statement? So as you may know, your interview is only one piece of the puzzle, and sometimes it's only 10 minutes long, maybe 15, 20 minutes. Some schools, I think I've heard of a half hour, 45 minutes. But the vast majority of schools only spend a short period of time actually interviewing you, and they use your personal statement as another way to gauge your personality as well as your writing style. So your personal statement, again, is for them to assess who you are as a person, get to know you, assess your goals, maybe your educational background, your work ethic, and your writing style. Now, remember, you're entering into a doctoral degree. There's going to be a lot of graduate level writing involved in getting your doctoral degree. So again, they want to really assess your writing skills. They want to assess your word choices, whether it's unprofessional or maybe you're more of a conversational writer, which is definitely the problem that I have when I write. It's more like I write like I'm actually talking to you in person versus writing. So being aware of where maybe you're lacking and addressing these areas prior to starting on your personal statement. And we'll kind of get into how you can do this and some resources for you to utilize to make sure that you're really looking over your writing prior to submitting that personal statement. So again, and some of the things to point out as far as looking at your writing style, they will think, well, is this student going to need a lot of guidance and a lot of help to get them up to speed to be able to succeed at writing this paper? And let's just say they have 2 candidates who relatively are about the same and interviewed and scored about the same. While one of them has a good personal statement, the other one is kind of just mediocre. They may lean to the student who had a better personal statement, knowing they're going to need less help and less guidance to actually do all the doctoral writing involved in the program. So I'm not trying to unencourage you if writing is not your strong suit. Just know that you need to make sure you make your personal statement strong. And then when you're in school, you're going to have to rely on additional resources to make sure you're getting extra help and proofreading where you need it. So it doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that you're going to need some extra help, and you need to identify that prior to submitting your personal statement. And just to also point out too, we've had students who English is their second language, and they've needed 3, 4, 5 edits on their personal statement, and they still get into school. And yes, may they require some additional help during all their writing? Sure. But now they know they can get assistance. They can get someone to proofread their papers for them and help them where it's necessary. So I don't want to make you feel like this is not possible if English is not your strong suit. You can do this. You just, again, have to be aware of the possible help you're going to need along the way to accomplish the goal. Okay, so that's been addressed. So let's kind of get into, the structure and maybe some red flags that I want to point out. So students sometimes, to make themselves sound like they're good writers, sometimes what they do is they inflate their verbiage, meaning they use these big vocabulary words, and they think the more big words they use, the more, or maybe it'll make them sound smarter, right? But the problem is, if you don't truly understand the word, not only is it going to become difficult to read quickly, and let me also remind you that these programs are getting 150, 200 applicants or more sometimes. And so they have a lot of essays to read. And so if it's difficult to read, you're automatically going to trigger something in their brain that's going to say, oh, it's just, I can't, I need to be able to read this efficiently and quickly. And they're using so many fancy words that I have to slow down and really ask myself, what do they mean by that? And the reason why I want to bring that up is because, again, not that you want to not be aware of the word choices you're using and use language that, again, aids in your descriptions, but just be cognizant of the flow of that and how difficult it is for someone to read quickly and get the gist of what you're trying to say. Richard Wilson, who does guided Q&As inside the Academy, pointed out that sometimes it's not really about the word definition matches, but it might be used out of context a little bit. So again, you may have to be aware that even though the word definition fits to what you're trying to describe, maybe it's not used in the best context or the best flow for the sentence. So also want to point out that you need to proofread. It looks, kind of sloppy if you make pretty basic grammar errors in your essay. It just kind of shows them that you didn't really take the time to do your due diligence, essentially, to proofread the paper prior to submitting it. So, you really need to, if that means getting help to do that, read it over when your eyes are not fatigued. I know me, sometimes I read something and I put letters where I think they should go in my brain, but I didn't actually write that down. Especially when I'm fatigued, I tend to do that more frequently. I miss little tiny errors that I've made. If you haven't used something called Grammarly, I highly recommend you do that. But that isn't everything. There is a free version of it, and while it's amazing, it definitely, unless you pay for it, you can only get so much out of it. But it shouldn't replace a good proofread, but it's definitely a good place to start. And again, it's called Grammarly. You can install it on Google Chrome. So definitely make sure you're doing that for your first proofread, for example. Also, I've noticed too, when you take documents and put it into a Word doc, Google Doc or whatnot, again, it'll do some proofreading for you, but it actually can flip words that you may not even catch because maybe your spelling was off a little bit and it'll pick a word that's similar, but maybe it's so similar that you didn't catch it. You have to be really careful about that too. So you think you're correcting a misspelling, but in reality, you're completely changing the word altogether. But maybe your brain doesn't recognize that right away because it's so similar to the word that you wanted to say. So you have to be really, really careful because don't rely on spell check and Grammarly to do everything for you. You really still need to put second eyes on that paper, walk away, come back, that type of thing. So yes, you need to proofread. And I actually want to take this moment to also share with you guys a story from one of our students. Because another thing that can happen too is when you're writing multiple personal statements, sometimes you may make the mistake and leave in the wrong school name, for example. Maybe you express how you would be a good candidate for school X and you submit that personal statement for school Y. And even though it was relatively the same prompt and you updated the prompt to kind of match, you left in the wrong school name. That happens, and probably more often than I would even probably realize it probably happens. It's really easy to do. So let me kind of just share with you guys this because, again, this is from one of our students. I thought it was a great takeaway. All right. Hey, Jenny and CSPA family. I just want to take time out to thank everybody who was a part of this community. This is my testimony to the effectiveness of the program. Back in June of 2021, Richard helped me write a very concise and thoughtful letter of intent. This letter, along with my decent stats, got me interviews at 2 out of 3 schools. I used the content in CSPA library and the resources on the site to prepare for my interviews. I was offered a seat on the spot during my first interview. The second program also offered me a seat 2 weeks after my interview. I want to pause here and mention the importance of being honest, prepared, and not let your mistakes define you. I sent my letter of intent with another school name on it to the program that offered me a seat on the spot. Many people told me to forget about ever getting into that program. Instead of giving up, I wrote a letter to the director of the program explaining my mistake and showing her I take responsibility for my actions. She later told me in the interview that my honesty and willingness to take responsibility for my actions without making excuses is why she wants me in her program. I owe my acceptance to this community. During my second interview, I was able to interpret graphs that I saw in one of Richard's presentations. The interviewer told me I was the only one who was able to correctly interpret the data out of so many applicants. So thank you, Jenny, Richard, and everyone in this community. I look forward to using CSPA resources and Crush CRNA School. So first, I love that because again, I just love everything about it. But the takeaway from this for you today is the fact that this student had to own his mistake, and he did this. He put the wrong school on his personal statement and sent it. He still got offered a spot on the spot during his CRNA interview, which is amazing. Now, a couple takeaways from this. One, he owned his mistake. There are probably plenty of students who make this mistake who are fearful. And like he said, plenty of people told him just to walk away, to give up on that school. It's not going to happen. He made a mistake and he's got to live with it, right? But instead, he was like, I don't want it to end that way. I have to at least let them know that I'm aware that I made the mistake. And that's what these schools really want. They want a student who has a voice to say, hey, I messed up. I'm sorry. That's so important as far as your attitude. And again, that's what they're looking for in a candidate. So it's not all about your ICU background, your 4.0 GPA, etc. They really want to see that personality characteristic that you're going to take ownership for when you make mistakes. But I also love the fact that he was very well prepared for his interviews, and that also clearly displayed in his interview, skills. Discuss preparing your resume for CRNA school and some of the things that you should avoid, as well as some things that you should be thinking about, like little nuances, I would call them, so that you're making a good impression. So let's go ahead and get into it. So first and foremost, I want to make sure that when you guys start doing your resume for CRNA school, that you are not treating this process like checking a box. They will be able to tell if that is the case. It'll essentially make it look like you are not putting a full amount of effort into it, or that maybe even you're not the most serious applicant. So make sure that when you work on your resume, that again, that you're kind of putting a lot of effort and time into making sure that it's just easy to read, it flows nice, it's well organized, and that you 100 million times triple check the spelling. I use Grammarly. I don't know. There's a free version of it. Just copy and paste and stick it in Grammarly real quick, because if you're like me, I make typos without even realizing I made them. So I will literally reread something like 5 times and be like, how did I not see that? So I use Grammarly a lot for that reason. So I get it. It's sometimes it's hard to proofread your own stuff because your brain is plugging in words that aren't actually there, or it's correcting the mistake because that's what you meant to say, but you didn't type it out that way. So make sure you have someone else lay eyes on your resume too. Have, your coworker, your friend, your mom, dad, whoever. You can also do a resume review with CRNA School Prep Academy's expert providers. So that's always an option as well. I will definitely link to that below in the show notes. But yeah, make sure again that you're putting a lot of effort into your resume, because kind of if you think about an invitation to a wedding or an invitation to anything for that matter, it's kind of like your first impression. And I hate to say, you always say don't judge a book by its cover, but the reality is people do and will kind of judge you based on your resume, right? That's kind of like their first impression of you. They don't know you. They don't know your personality. And there's something to be said with actually physically hearing someone speak and telling the tone of voice, their eye contact, all of those things that really go into how you display yourself, where a piece of paper just can't usually do you justice. So you have to really go above and beyond to make sure when someone's reading a piece of paper, if they're in a bad mood or had a bad experience and they go into reading your resume, that you're going to make them smile somehow, versus, again, they're not going to know you or not going to hear a tone of voice or anything like that. So I think one of the most going into like things that mistakes people make when they do their resume is they want to highlight their clinical experience, and they tend to do this in place of their education. That is a mistake. If you think about it, you're applying to grad school. You're not applying to a job. Now, if you took your old template from when you were applying to your ICU position, maybe it mattered more about your work experience as a nurse's aide, right? Because you're applying to a work position. You're applying to work as a nurse versus you're not applying to school to go work as a nurse. You're applying to school. So your educational background really should be front and center. And the other reason why you should really put your education at the very top of your resume versus going right into your clinical experience is because it's going to be a shorter section. It's going to be more concise to the point. And if you were to put that at the end of your resume, they have to read through all your clinical stuff just to find your education. It's by the time they get there, they may just kind of skim over it real quick, and you're not going to be able to highlight your accomplishments as well. And again, remember you're applying to grad school for a grad school position. So highlight your educational background. Where did you get the degree? So the name of your school. When did you graduate? And not just the year. Some people make this mistake where they put, I graduated in 2020. Well, did you graduate in May of 2020 or December of 2020? Because this really can say, oh, they graduated in May of 2020, so they have 6 more months of experience versus someone who graduated in December of 2020. So just differentiate yourself, make it known like, oh, I graduated, but I graduated in January of 2020. So I had an entire year of 2020 with experience under my belt. How well did you do? I get asked this question a lot as far as should you be placing your GPA on your resume? And the answer can kind of go both ways. I do think if you have a 3.5 or higher, you should definitely be highlighting that on your resume. I mean, at the end of the day, you guys are going to be reviewing your transcripts and calculating your GPA regardless. So if you don't do this step, it's perfectly okay. But I think, again, if it's something like if you're a B+ student on average and you have a 3.5, I think you should highlight that. Why not? It's going to take up very little room, and you might as well just highlight it. But if you have someone who has maybe a 3.0, 3.2, this could be something that maybe it's just better left off the resume. Again, they're going to be calculating your GPA, with your transcripts anyways. But it gives you space to really highlight other things, like maybe you were given an award, or maybe you served on a committee, in nursing school, something like that. So make sure that you're using your resume to highlight your strengths. That's always what your resume is all about. So again, that's kind of explains as far as highlighting your GPA, and things like that. As far as I know, some of you are taking different routes, right, to become a nurse. Some of you have gotten your ADN, then your BSN. Some of you have a bachelor's in biology, and then you get an accelerated BSN. So, depending on what you do, make sure you put your most current schooling up top, meaning if you had your ADN and got your BSN should be at the top of the page, versus the other way around. You should always go with the most current ICU experience, current education experience, degree at the top, and then kind of list the older experience below that. And also another tip is spell out your degrees, such as like a bachelor's. You put bachelor's degree in biology versus BS in biology. That's just kind of a nuance that, again, Mr. Richard Wilson pointed out to me that as a faculty member, he appreciates seeing things spelled out. It doesn't take up a lot of room on your resume, and it just sounds and looks better. Okay, we discussed GPA. So, and same thing, if you had, cum laude, things like that, you can definitely put that on your resume. And then also another piece of advice that was kind of given by Dr. Dawn Abushan, who has also been a program director for several years and is now a program faculty at a CRNA college. If you're in a current course, like, because a lot of you are taking courses, right? And you're like, oh, should I list individual courses? I don't get a degree at this college, but I took individual courses there. You don't need to list individual courses if it's going to reflect on your transcripts. But if you're currently in a course and it's not going to reflect on your transcripts because when you submitted your transcripts, the course hasn't finished, you definitely can and should highlight the course you're in. And what I would recommend, and what these program faculty have recommended, is for you to approach your professor wherever you're at in the course and ask them for just a short letter that they can sign that says, such and such is in X, Y, and Z course, is such and such into the semester. I anticipate them getting X grade in the course. Have them anticipate what they think your final grade will be, as long as you keep performing as you have been performing in the course. It's kind of like an unofficial way of them saying, I anticipate the student to achieve an A- or achieve an A or achieve a B+, whatever it may be. And it just kind of shows these schools that you are kind of taking something additional so they don't miss it. Because again, after you actually have completed the course, you could submit that course to go into your overall GPA as long as they're able to take things after the deadline. This is something, again, that you can reach out to the program and let them know, hey, is it possible for me to submit this course after I take it, even though the deadline for applications is X date, 2 weeks later, I'm going to have my final grade. I can submit an anticipated grade. And then once my transcripts, once this course is complete and it reflects on my transcripts, I can submit that. A lot of schools will take that into consideration. So something to think about, but don't think you have to list all these individual courses you've done at different schools, as long as it reflects on your transcripts. So that's just something also to think about. But again, I've heard this argued both ways but again, just make sure that your transcripts are solid, review your transcripts. Don't just submit them and not look at them. I've had students that's happened where they think they take their transcripts from a school and submit it, and then they come to find afterwards they didn't submit all their transcripts like they thought they did. So make sure you're laying eyeballs on your transcripts, especially if you're submitting from multiple schools. You don't want something to get missed. You can list things like honors, societies, rewards, committees, but you don't have to actually put, what you actually did, but just list the fact that you have received such rewards, or you served on the Student Nurse Association for your college, that kind of thing. You can list that kind of stuff there. And again, along the lines of like cum laude, magna cum laude, things like that. That wraps it up for today, future CRNA. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed these episodes. As a reminder, if you're looking for the full episode on which ICU is best for CRNA school, that is episode number 6. If you're looking for the episode on the personal statement, that is episode number 56. And then finally, if you're looking to listen to the full episode on how to prepare your resume, that is going to be episode 79. I hope you guys enjoyed, and you guys take care until next time. Bye-bye. Hey, future CRNA, as always, I appreciate you and your loyalty. Thank you so very much for tuning in this week. I'd love to hear from you, so screenshot this episode and share it to your IG stories with your biggest takeaway. Don't forget to tag me at CRNA School Prep Academy so I can personally thank you. Be sure to head over to CRNASchoolPrepAcademy.com to check out our blog and gather free resources to help you along your CRNA journey. Stay strong, and I'll see you next week.